I'm really grateful for you inviting me here again. I was wandering through Paddington Station not long ago, and a little man came to me and said, he said, didn't you used to be Paddy Ashdown? I said, I thought I probably had been at some stage or another. And the fact that you've invited me here tonight seems to indicate that I still am, and that's jolly reassuring for me. I'm going to be serious. It was George Bernard Shaw who I think said, if you're going to say something serious, for God's sake, make them laugh or they'll kill you. And there isn't many laughs in this speech. You better have them all at the beginning. Here's a little story. I'm going to be talking about the peccadillos and sins of our present political generation. Here's a story about a sin of a previous member of the British political establishment. If I were to say the word George Brown to you all, you will remember who this was, and amongst the more grey-head in the audience it may even evoke a small titter, as indeed it has. So George, as you know, had two sins, or some of us know, had two sins, which were minor in comparison to the sins of present politicians, one might argue. The first was an attachment to a glass of whiskey, and the other was an attraction to a pretty face. And so here's a story of our British Foreign Secretary, the son of a railwayman from Belper, but loved by the Foreign Office, despite his trades union ways, because he was a very tough negotiator. And they sent him down to sign the Anglo-Peruvian trade deal. And he went down, he signed it, and afterwards there was a cocktail party, there was a reception. And Foreign Office records reveal that he had one whiskey, and then he had a second. Ladies and gentlemen, he may even have had a third, in fact, probably a fourth. But when he went into the room, he spotted in the corner a very beautiful woman in a long red dress that came down to her ankles. Anyway, after he'd had 4 whiskies, they started to play some music, so he thought he'd ask her for a dance. So he went up to this very beautiful woman with a long red dress that came down to her ankles, and he said to her, "Madam, would you like a dance?" And she said no, for 3 reasons. First of all, you are drunk. Secondly, this is the national anthem. And thirdly, I am the Cardinal Archbishop of Lima. So that's your laugh. Okay, you've had your laugh. Now it's serious. Well, during the summer, I went to stay with Professor Charles Handy, the well-known prophet of the post-industrial society during the 80s and 90s, may well be known to some of you, and he was, for many of that era, a guru, including for me. We talked at the time, as everyone was, about the MP's expenses scandal. His view, Charles Candy's view, was that we were seeing the death throes of national politics. All politics in the future, he said, would either be supranational or local. Well, you don't have to agree with the totality of that view to recognize, even if our political establishment still refuse to, that the expenses scandal is not the disease rotting the heart out of our politics, but merely a symptom of it. To be honest, I never much liked the House of Commons, and if I'm truthful, it never much liked me either. Probably, if I were to look back with honesty, I would say that I may have been more to blame for that than it. But I always disliked the atmosphere of the 19th century gentleman's club. And no doubt it disliked my habit of making this abundantly clear, sometimes in a manner which could, from time to time, I admit, tip into priggishness. I loved being Member of Parliament for Yeovil, of course. It was and remains the pinnacle of my life. But you do not have to love your place of work to love your job. And anyway, I never really believed that politics had to be confined to what happened in the Commons chamber. For me, it was always much more about what happened beyond Westminster, in the myriad communities of our country and in the lives of its ordinary citizens. It was perhaps this tension which led me more than a decade ago to start making speeches, some of them at the conference, about the dangerous gap opening up between government and governed, between politicians and people. And by the way, not just in Britain, but in all the advanced Western democracies. Or perhaps it was just because part of being a liberal is to understand the fragility of the democratic contract between the people and their parliament, and to be constantly alert for signs of decay or disease. Here's a passage from a speech which I made to the RSA in 1999. Success for Britain, I said, can only come if the culture and structure of our politics matches that of modern successful institutions making their way where we must in an increasingly globalized world. We too, I concluded, must be part of that paradigm shift. Well, since then, since 1999, things have got progressively worse, much worse. Now, public respect for the whole political process is in danger of terminal collapse. Now, significantly, up to the outbreak of the expenses scandal, people concluded that their local MP was separate from this decline of faith. But now, parliamentarians themselves are in the mire, and by the way, in both houses. In the welter of self-recrimination, bordering, I have to confess, on self-pity, which followed the Daily Telegraph's revelation, everyone in all parties, up to our very masters themselves, rushed to throw on their brand new suits of sackcloth and ashes, you will remember. There was an acknowledged understanding then, at the height of the scandal, that things had to change right down to the roots of our politics. But now, like the bankers, we think we've got away with it. Just clean up the expenses system, and we can basically leave things as they are. That's the current mood in Westminster. The government's most radical proposal is to set up a democracy council made up of, yep, you've guessed it, government ministers themselves. And the Conservatives have returned to being, well, conservative. Their most radical proposal, it seems to me, is to raise the price of a salad in the House of Commons cafeteria. They oppose any and every root and branch constitutional reform which would alter the balance between Parliament and the people, just as they have opposed every reform in the past, from the Great Reform Act of 1832 to devolution for Scotland and Wales in 1997. Mr. Cameron's slogan at the next election will, let me assure you, be some version of time for a change. But he does not want to change the system. He wants to inherit the system. All he wants to change is who occupies number 10 Downing Street. And that, as we know from all our past experience, will change absolutely nothing. The mood in Westminster is no longer, what can we do to put this right? But, phew, we got away with it. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a most powerful misjudgment, and not just because the public, when they come to speak at the general election, may well send us a much more uncomfortable message. With the recession in full swing, with the pain in terms of our ordinary citizens, with the pain of that not yet at its peak for ordinary people, and with normal politics held in such low regard, these are perfect conditions for demagogues offering simple solutions. We are already seeing the voters turning from the conventional parties to the ugly ones in much larger numbers. And now we have the emergence of a new breed of celebrity politicians promising to clean things up, a new form of Westminster-style reality TV. I'm a celebrity, get me into there. Let's be clear. If the answer to rebuilding trust in our politics is Esther Ranson riding in to clean up Parliament on a tide of soapsuds, then I fear we have asked ourselves the wrong question. Which is, of course, exactly the point. Expenses are not the problem. They are merely a symptom of that disease which is now eating the very heart out of our politics. Now, I could at this stage enjoy myself and perhaps even amuse you by turning the speech into a tirade about how the whole ethos and culture of the House of Commons still lies in the 19th century. I could complain that Parliament still treats us as subjects, not as citizens. I could say that the first instincts of most of Parliament's members on both sides are those of an elite still living in an age of deference which everyone else knows died an unlamented death long, long ago. And if you think that is excessive, then ask yourself this question. How on earth could members of Parliament, with the single and proud exception of the Liberal Democrats, have voted by such a huge majority, and by the way, with the clear and tacit support of the two big party leaders, to hide the expenses embarrassment from us by the simple act of exempting Parliament from the provision of its own Freedom of Information Act? How did they think they could get away with it? I honestly thought they probably thought they would get away with it, and if it hadn't been for us, Liberal Democrats, they might well have got away with it. You know, the other day, I asked the parliamentary authorities why in this modern age St Pancras has a Wi-Fi with free access for its customers, but Parliament hasn't. And I got a most revealing reply. I was told in no uncertain terms I was wrong. Parliament did indeed have a secure Wi-Fi system for the use of all its parliamentarians. There was a somewhat shocked silence when I pointed out that parliamentarians are not the customers of Parliament, we are the staff. Our customers are the public. And they replied that no one had ever considered a Wi-Fi system with internet access for them. Now, I could have fun and devote the whole of the rest of this speech to this topic alone, but I'm not going to, because this too, although true, is beside the issue. There are plenty of modern accessible parliaments in the world whose attitudes towards their voters are much more healthy than Westminster's, but who are nevertheless still suffering the same decline in public interest, confidence and trust. No, the answer, I think, lies much closer to Charles Handy's arresting proposition that national politics, at least in its present form, is dying. And there are, I think, two reasons for this, two forces which from opposite directions are tearing it apart. The globalization of power and the atomization of the way we live our lives in the modern age. Now, of the two, globalization is much the more talked about and much the more obvious. Our national politicians do their damnedest to pretend that globalization applies to everyone else but not to them, which is curious, because just as the globalization of commerce and industry made the old 19th century smokestack industries irrelevant, the globalization of power, and by the way problems too, is making our systems of national politics, created, let us remember, in the smokestack era, more and more irrelevant too. And it's doing so first and most powerfully by cruelly revealing that the central democratic contract, which lies at the very heart of our politics, is in fact a fraud. The electoral promise itself, in its present form, is a lie. You see, at elections, we all, and that includes us Liberal Democrats, I fear, make this solemn promise: just elect me to Westminster, and once I am there, I will deliver for you all that I have promised you. The lie that we tell is that both the problem and the power to put it right still lie solely at Westminster. We pretend that Westminster can still propose and dispose in all things, just as Westminster always had since our modern parliamentary system was established, as though nothing had happened to change anything. But something very big has happened, which changes everything. Globalization changes everything for politics just as much as it does for everything else and everyone else. The phenomenon of our time is that power is fast migrating out of the structures of the nation state, which we created to hold power accountable and make it subject to regulation and the rule of law, and into the global space where the instruments of regulation are few and the framework of law is weak. Just look for a moment at the institutions which are having difficulties at the moment. National governments, political structures, the old establishments. And note with me that all exist within the nation state and are confined by its borders. Now look at those institutions which are growing in power and reach. The internet, the satellite broadcasters, the transnational corporations, the international money changers and speculators, international crime, international terrorism. And note that all operate oblivious of national borders and largely beyond the reach of national laws made by national parliaments. For these new centres of global power, which frequently have a powerful and painful impact on our lives, Westminster is almost totally irrelevant. Now, what makes this even more urgent, even more dangerous, is that it is not just power that has been globalized, but problems have been globalized too. Global warming, almost certainly the most potent existential threat to our long-term security, is, as we all know, a global problem, not a Westminster one. If we are to solve it, we have to create global institutions, not Westminster ones. Ditto, by the way, international terrorism, ditto swine flu, ditto the global recession, ditto almost everything in our deeply interconnected world. The uncomfortable truth, which our politicians at Westminster refuse to acknowledge, and our old institutions can find no way to cope with, is that there is now almost no problem which affects our citizens' well-being or our nation's future, which can be solved within the nation-state acting alone. Not our ability to protect ourselves, not the cleanliness of our environment, not our capacity to tackle global warming, not our health, not our jobs, not even our mortgages. All of these and more now depend not on the actions of our national governments, but on their ability to work with others within a set of institutions which are global in scope and international in character. One of the reasons why liberalism is one of the only answers to the conundrums of our age, because the core value of our party, internationalism, is now increasingly the only solution even to the problems of our domestic citizens and our internal problems in Britain. Now, there is a rule of history which we liberals understand better than any other. Where power goes, governance must follow. And if it doesn't, then the result is turbulence and chaos and criminality. If the globalization of power and problems is one of the key phenomena of our time, then bringing governments to the global space is one of the key challenges of our time. And this will require Westminster to share power with supranational institutions above the level of the nation state, to pool some of its sovereignty with others, because it is only by working with others on the international scene that our governments will be better able to deliver what the citizens of this country want: jobs, health, safety, a clean space, a peaceful future. Now, our nearest neighbourhood supranational institution is, of course, the European Union, the world's first, albeit so far mightily flawed, testbed for a regional supranational institution. And my guess, by the way, is that we're going to see more of these regional organizations emerging in the years ahead as other nations begin to respond to the issue of global power. My guess, too, is that increasingly EU citizens will see that in a more chilly and more turbulent world, we are not any longer going to be able to rely on our friends in quite the same way that we have in the past, including, by the way, those on the other side of the Atlantic. And then I think the case for deeper European integration will become both more necessary and easier to make. And by the way, a political point. Because of that fact, which will bear in on any future UK government, because of that, the unthinking, irrational, visceral anti-Europeanism of the Tory party, now deeper than in any political party in the past, will make the issue of Europe just as deadly a toxin at the heart of the Tories as it ever has been. On Europe, the Tory party are a schism waiting to happen, and it will break them apart as surely in the future as it has in the past, if, God help us all, they do become our government again and have to face the real world in which they have to govern and we have to live. But that is the subject, I suspect, for a different speech. Let me return to this one. Supranational institutions, such as the European Union, may be one way for nations to pool sovereignty in order to have greater influence in a globalized world, but they are not in themselves mechanism for bringing governance to the global space. Here we are going to need truly global frameworks, not just regional ones. And if you look carefully, you can see that they are already beginning to emerge. Not through spawning more United Nations institutions, much that I might like to see that, but through treaty-based organizations such as Kyoto, such as the G20. But that too, perhaps, is a subject for a different time. The point for this time is that medium-sized nations will do better for their citizens if they are successful at working multilaterally with others, including and perhaps especially as the balance of world power shifts, those outside the cozy circle of our Atlantic friends. In other words, we can only make sense of politics in this globalized world through a new democratic settlement of power above the nation state. The key question is not, which we have to address by the way, the key question is not whether we have to do this, but how can we make these institutions efficient and democratically accountable. And what this means is that Westminster will in the future serve its voters better, the better it is able to share power and work with others in our region and in the wider world. In our modern interconnected age, the most important part of what you can do is what you can do with others. By the way, that's Ashdown's third law. The most important part of what you can do, both internally in our country and externally on the international scene, the most important part of what you can do is what you can do with others. It isn't the institutions that matter, it's the interconnectors, it's the docking point, it's your capacity to work in partnership. But this is only half the story, for there is a countervailing force tearing apart the old historic democratic settlement of the Westminster-style nation-state from the opposite direction too. Not only are our lives becoming increasingly globalized, they're also becoming increasingly atomized. This is the Facebook generation. It no longer lives its life inside the old structures, inherited from the past. It is in daily inventing new structures for a new way of life. A person's friends are no longer determined by geography. Habits are no longer shaped by the old notions of society. What is fashionable amongst your friends tends to be more influential than the conventions of your parents. Many, especially the young, look, frankly, not to the old structures of authority to deliver what they want, but to the new empowering networks of the internet revolution. And for those who might like to argue that, well, this is all fun, but it has no relevance to the exercise of power, they might like to reflect on the political history of the modern communications revolution. The new technology of the early 1990s was the fax, and it proved deadly as an instrument in the overthrow of the communist dictatorships of Eastern Europe. It was the instrument by which people communicated. By the late 1990s, it was the email. I remember smuggling computers into Yugoslavia under President Milosevic, and they proved deadly to the dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic. And this summer, we watched one of the world's most closed regimes come to the very edge of collapse as a result of text messages and the mobile phone camera. My view, by the way, is that the Iranian counter-revolution cannot now be stopped. It may not triumph this month, it may not triumph next, or next year for that either, but sooner or later, once unleashed, this will succeed. And when, in due course, a new Iran emerges, perhaps in the form of the world's first authentic Islamic democracy, it will have done so because of the way that the new technologies have empowered even the most powerless in even the most closed of regimes. Now, the revolution going on in our own societies may be less noisy, but it is no less powerful. And business understands it very well, even if Westminster does not. Success in modern business comes not through the old techniques of piling it high and selling it cheap, but through understanding that today the customer is king. It comes not through the vertical command structures of the Industrial Revolution to which Westminster is attached, but to flat networks whose job it is to network and to serve the citizen. Choice here is the key. Go into a supermarket and you can see it clear enough. Those who respond to their customer needs best and provide them with the widest choice win. And those who don't die. And that's one of the reasons why Westminster is dying. People are fed up with the mismatch between the way they are treated in the marketplace, where the customer is king, where they're listened to, and where the choices are left to them, and the way they are governed by a distant institution, cut off from their everyday lives, which offers them a non-choice once every 4 years, and in between doesn't listen and behaves with ignorance or arrogance, and often both at the same time. I could not frankly put it better than our leader Nick Clegg in a recent speech on the subject, when here's what he said. Think about the great institutions which interface with the ordinary citizen, the BBC, social services, the health service, the education system. Like most of our great national achievements, he said, in the 20th century, these were created by government to deliver services to the people. Now think about the institutions that are already shaping the 21st century. Google, Wikipedia, Facebook, YouTube. These are about something very different. They are about tools created by ordinary people which enable them to deliver services to each other. The old model, Nick said, model it could have been, the old model, Nick said, was about constructing the institutional hardware of the paternalistic state. But the new model is about developing the democratic software of the empowered society. The old model was controlled by a professional elite. The new model is operated by ordinary people. The old model worked from the top down, with service users viewed as passive recipients at the end of the process. The new model works from the bottom up and views individuals as active participants in the design and development of the services they use. Yet, he continued, and here's the crucial point for the political community, this increasingly affluent, well-educated, self-confident cohort are still treated as supplicants when they knock on the government's door. This is true of our political relationships with government, where they feel cut off, shut out, ignored. It is true of their bureaucratic relationship with government, which they rightly view as faceless, unresponsive, dysfunctional. Here's how Nick ended. This is the great paradox of our times. In our private and professional lives, we have never been more empowered. But in our relationship with the state, we remain as powerless as we ever have been. Exactly. You know, perhaps there is no issue more powerful, more explosive than the issue of personal identity. For this is what tells us who we are, and it is the essential glue that holds our state together. In the old model of the nation-state, people had only one identity, the unitary identity which attached us to the unitary nation-state. If you had asked me 40 years ago, when I was a British soldier, who I was, I suspect I would have answered British, and that was enough. Today, if you ask me who I am, I have to give you a very different answer. Being only British is not enough. I was born in India. I am of Irish blood, and part of it. I belong to the community of the West Country of England, which I represented in Parliament. And I am British, and I am a European. And unless I can describe myself in all these ways, I cannot describe the space in which I want to live my life and in which I want my children to be free to live theirs as well. You see, we do not any longer just live in a nation state. It's not enough. We need to be able to live in multiple spaces at the same time. And here is the point. If you will only allow people one space and one identity, if you will only allow a Catholic in Belfast to be British but not Irish, or a Serb in Sarajevo to be Bosnian but not Serb, then you end up with blood on your streets. Now look around you. The signs of this fundamental disconnect, disenchantment, disengagement with Westminster model politics are plain to see in the apathy and abstention of voters, most especially amongst the young. In the general election turnouts between 1950 and 1992, those turnouts were between 84 and 71%, with typically, by the way, over 90% voting either Tory or Labour for the big two. But the last two elections have seen a major decline, with turnouts now 59 and 61%, of which, by the way, only 68% voted for one or other of the two main parties. And by the way, the combined Tory and Labour votes reached an all-time low of 44% in the recent Euro elections, when more than half of all voters looked beyond the two established brokers of British politics to cast their vote. More than a third of Britain now does not bother to vote. And if the trend continues, it cannot be long before we dip below the 50% mark, a point long ago reached when it comes to local and European elections. But this is not just a British phenomenon. The same broad trend, though usually not as bad, is happening in all the advanced Western democracies too, with by far the biggest abstention occurring amongst with those with most to gain and most to lose, the young voters themselves. And what is more, a word of caution, this downward decline appears stubbornly resistant to all our attempts to jazz up politics or make voting easier by widening postal voting or extend it to the internet. And what is more, please note, Liberal Democrats, the trend is not just visible in voting. It is there very clearly in participation rates in political parties themselves. Here, membership age is rising, while overall numbers are dropping in all the parties. But significantly, not in single-issue campaigning pressure or lobby groups, such as Greenpeace, the RSPB. Their membership has been rising. The RSPB now has more members than all the political parties put together. Live 8, Make Poverty History, the Countryside March, the anti-Iraq War protest, all attracted support from hundreds of thousands of passionate, politically engaged people on the streets of London and elsewhere. According to a recent survey, more than half the UK population claims to have volunteered at least once a month. And the number of people participating in consumer boycotts using purchasing power as an alternative to political power has shot up from 6% in 1974 to 20% today. So it is not that people are not more broadly politically aware or engaged. Quite the opposite. It is only formal Westminster politics that they are withdrawing from, not wider political engagement. Now, what can we conclude from these figures, except that people are withdrawing from the Westminster political process because they think it doesn't matter, because they feel it doesn't change anything, because they feel excluded. And they are right. The separation between politics and people, between government and governed, cannot be solved by simply cleaning up our Westminster Act, or by jazzing up the voting system, or by new gimmicks as to how candidates are selected. We need something far more radical, far more fundamental, if we are to reconnect with the democratic process and re-engage participation amongst ordinary members of the public. We have to have the courage to let people have more power to choose for themselves. We have to take power away from Westminster and put it closer to the people Westminster is supposed to serve. If you're a little older like me, you may remember one of the defining struggles of the post-war years was between the boss of what was then the UK's biggest but now sadly defunct car maker, British Leyland, Sir Michael Edwards, and the leader of the Leyland Trades Union, Red Robber. Edwards' reforms decentralised production and made individual workers more responsible, including for the quality of their work. And the workers didn't like it. They didn't want it. Red Robber said, if you remember, that it wasn't the job of the workers to be responsible. Their job was to turn up every day, put in their hours, and draw their wages. It was up to the management to make decisions, not the workers. And it was up to the bosses to be responsible for quality, not the union members. You know, I think our national politics today is almost exactly where British Leyland was in the 19th century, in the 1970s, failing fast and for much the same reason. Because it has bred an unhealthy culture of dependency, which is no longer sustainable in the face of the coalition of disenchantment now growing up between the disconnected, who feel no responsibility for the decisions that government takes, and the sophisticated, who are no longer prepared to be left powerless and taken for granted. Now, perhaps this didn't matter as much as it should, while we lived safely cocooned in the recent age of contentment. The wags used to say in the dying days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that the difference between Berlin and Vienna was that in Berlin things were serious but not catastrophic, while in Vienna things were catastrophic but not serious. Perhaps living as we have done for the last half-century, through a period of rising economic well-being and living standards, this deep cancer at the heart of our politics, though catastrophic, was not serious. Because people were in the end content to maintain the fiction, provided that it provided the goodies. But if, as I suspect, we are now moving out of the politics of contentment and into a much harsher age, if the trick of government is no longer the easy one of sharing out the prosperity of growth, but the much more difficult one of sharing out the pain of retrenchment, then we should not be surprised if the pressures this creates blows apart the whole rickety, patched-up, out-of-date, smokestack structure of our politics, which is now so obviously well past its sell-by date. Charles Handy believes that Westminster and government at the nation-state level may well vanish altogether. Well, maybe one day it will. Maybe one day we will get to a situation where, like Switzerland, we don't know the name of our cabinet, but we do know who is on our parish council. Given the lacklustre nature of the present crew, the thought is, I confess, rather tempting. But this, if it ever happens, is a long time ahead. What is clear and urgent for now, however, is that tinkering with codes of conduct for members of Parliament and making voting easier is not going to solve the present democratic crisis in our country. If our democracy is to be fit for purpose in the modern age, what we need next is nothing less than a new settlement of political power in our country, a new Great Reform Act. Westminster has got to start living in the real world and recognise that in many, if not most things, it serves its citizens best, not by hoarding power to itself, but by working with others on the international scene. The basic principle, however, should be to have power at the lowest level at which it is best exercised. Our national government should do far less, and if it did, I suspect it could do it far better. And by the way, it could certainly do it with far less, perhaps even half, the number of members of Parliament. Its role should be to manage only those things which have to be managed at the national level: our foreign affairs, our macroeconomics, our defence, the strategic frameworks for local planning, etc. It should also be charged with setting the standards and the framework of rights and entitlements which are every citizen's due in every corner of the country and have to be adhered to across the nation. But when it comes to deciding how these are to be delivered, that ought to be a matter for governments which are far closer to the citizen. So much more of the ability to raise and spend our taxes should be placed closest to the citizens for those things which matter most to their everyday lives, such as health, education, social services, the administration of justice, and the rule of law. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Liberal Democrats, if this means that one community chooses to deliver the standards set by the state in a manner different from others, well, that's their right. Does this mean that we'll get postcode lotteries? Certainly. But that's what power means at the local level. You know, I find nothing more ridiculous than hearing some Liberal Democrats who say they believe in local decision-making and then complaining about postcode lotteries. Of course, as you and I know, none of these things are new to the Liberal Democrats. It's what we've always believed in. Even when the unitary nation state was at the height of its powers, we ploughed this lonely furrow for the principle that power should lie close to the citizen. As that great liberal, Lord Ashdown, said in the days of Gladstone, where there is no powerful democracy, freedom does not reign. It is easier, he said, to find people fit to govern themselves than it is to find people fit to govern. Absolutely. But, fellow Liberal Democrats, today this is a lonely furrow no longer. Now this is an idea with a crowd behind it whose time has come. This is not about MPs' expenses. It's about all the old cries. It's about liberation. It's about getting the government off our back. It's about freedom, the freedom to shape our own lives where we can and not have to submit to the tyranny of the distant, arrogant, and out of touch to shape our lives for us. It's about matching taxation with representation. It's about the sovereignty of the people versus the sovereignty of Parliament. If we are to put right the deep-seated ills in our democracy, this is a revolution that has to happen. The Great Reform Act should be our battle cry again. It is our job as Liberal Democrats not to be part of the establishment, but part of the insurgency, to ensure that when the long march away from the tyranny of Westminster-dominated politics begins, we Liberal Democrats have to be at the very front of it. Thank you very much.